I'm joined now by Dr. Robert Cantu, one of the sports world's preeminent experts on concussions and brain injuries. Dr. Cantu is the author of 31 books on neurology and sports medicine, and he is the senior advisor to the NFL's Head, Neck, and Spine Committee. He is also the chairman of the Department of Surgery and director of sports medicine at Emerson Hospital in Concord, Massachusetts. Dr. Robert Cantu, thanks for joining us today.
Susan, glad to be aboard.
How do you define a concussion?
Concussion comes from the Latin word concussus, which means to shake violently. And that's really what's happening to the brain. It's being shaken very violently within the skull, either from a blow directly to the head, which is the most common, or a blow to another part of the body that whiplashes the head on the neck.
In football, do you have to sustain a big hit to get a concussion, or could repetitive smaller hits do the same damage?
Well, that's a great question. You have to sustain a fairly significant hit, to be sure, but it is interesting that when one has recording devices in helmets, and when in certain instances a concussion, for instance, might be occurring or recognized after the third or fourth hit on a given day, and not necessarily the biggest hit, but they're all appreciably high. They're usually above 50 G force.
So it can be a kind of cumulative process as well as a one-time process for the concussion to occur.
Yes.
What are the symptoms of a concussion?
Well, concussion symptoms there are usually about 26 of them that we look for, and they come in four big baskets. One basket is cognitive symptoms, such as difficulty with concentration, with memory, insight, judgment. Another basket is emotional symptoms, such as panic, anxiety, depression. Another basket are sleep symptoms, such as sleeping less than usual, more than usual, or trouble falling asleep. And the final basket is the biggest of them all. It's physical symptoms, such as headache, lightheadedness, dizziness, sensitivity to light, sensitivity to noise, etc.
So, do these symptoms occur within 24 hours of receiving the concussion? What are the time factors?
Well, that again is another great question, because although there are usually some symptoms that occur immediately after the head trauma and signal the onset of the concussion, there are symptoms that can occur within the next 24 hours and maybe even 48 hours. It is virtually unheard of, though, for concussion symptoms to occur 2 weeks after a given concussion.
When we talk about injuries in football, there seems to be some kind of cumulative notion here of injury. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. In people that have later life complications from too much cumulative head trauma, what we call chronic traumatic encephalopathy, we have cases of that in individuals that had no recognized concussions, just had accumulated thousands and in some cases tens of thousands of subconcussive blows.
How do you diagnose CTE?
Well, CTE can be clinically suspected by a constellation of symptoms in individuals that have accumulated a lot of repetitive brain trauma, not just concussions, but the subconcussive blows as well. And the symptoms that are typical are emotional symptoms, such as difficulty with anxiety, difficulties with impulse control, difficulties with depression, as well as cognitive symptoms, which manifest themselves usually with difficulty with recent memory and then eventually can progress on to what we refer to as frontal lobe type symptoms, where individuals have difficulty with judgment, insight, etc.
Can you actually see something in the brain when you do perhaps a brain scan or some other kind of imaging? Can you see physical manifestations of CTE?
Yeah, as of today, the absolute diagnosis of chronic traumatic encephalopathy requires special immunostaining of one's brain. So it means somebody, unfortunately, has had to die first. And then you're now using special immunostains that show up the abnormal protein tau, TAU, that is the hallmark of CTE when it's distributed in particular distributions in the brain.
What percentage of the inspections reveal CTE as opposed to something else?
We see at the Center for the Study of Traumatic Encephalopathy, and when I say we, I think it's very important that it's Dr. Ann McKee, who is the lead neuropathologist, and her team that is really doing the analysis of these brains. We see, though, a very abnormal slice, so to speak, of individual brains in the sense that these are very symptomatic people almost exclusively. These are people that have had emotional, cognitive symptoms that fit CTE and have had tragic things happen at the end of their life. That's why their brains are being studied. So it's not a great surprise that we have a very high incidence of CTE in the brains that we see. We don't see, and we desperately do believe we need to study, but we don't have brains sent to the center to be studied when individuals have played sports at high risk for CTE, but have gone on to have largely normal life expectancies and not had any emotional or cognitive problems. It's very difficult for families of these individuals to want to have their brains studied. So we really have studied very few in that category.
So basically, you don't really have enough of a control group.
Absolutely do not. We don't. And that's desperately what's needed. And we'll have a better handle on it when those that have contributed to our registry, those athletes which now number over 500 from a variety of sports who've donated their brains and spinal cords upon their death to be studied. Some of these individuals, hopefully most, will go through their lives without symptoms of CTE, and then their brains will become very meaningful. But obviously we're many decades away from that information.
What happens as CTE progresses?
Well, the symptoms get worse, unfortunately, and the disruption of one's life gets worse. The symptoms often start with loss of impulse control, kind of flying off the handle with things that you normally could handle that would be frustrating, and now you can't handle them. Very commonly, there's paranoid behavior. There's very common for there being depression. The loss of impulse control, though, often leads to verbal and physical abuse that causes one to perhaps have a career that was very productive now become not productive at all. Obviously, the difficulties with memory and recent memory especially feed into one not being productive. Obviously, financial reversals, that type of aggressive behavior often causes people to wind up in divorces and with family separation. All of that greatly enhances depression. So it's kind of a perfect storm that's brewing.
In your most recent book, Concussions and Our Kids, you talk about this issue. What happens when a child whose brain is still developing sustains a concussion?
Well, a child has the same symptoms as does an adult, but the child's brain is particularly vulnerable because the nerve fibers in a child are not fully myelinated. And myelin is a coating, much like you coat telephone wires. It improves transmission of impulses, but it also gives extra strength to the nerve tissue. And without the myelin, the same forces imparted to a youngster's brain can do more in the way of disruptive brain trauma, actually trauma to the neurons, the nerve cells themselves. The young brain is also more susceptible to the metabolic changes, what we refer to as excitotoxic shock of concussion, and the young brain is housed in a disproportionately big head on a very weak neck, and that bobblehead doll effect also greatly makes the youth's brain more vulnerable to the same amount of trauma as would otherwise be better able to be handled by an adult.
And at what point is the brain fully coded and developed? At what age?
Well, it's progressive as you get older, but it's late teens, early 20s before you're 100% myelinated.
What was the tipping point for concussion awareness in the NFL?
I believe that, again, it kind of was a perfect storm. I believe that Ted Johnson going public with his post-concussion syndrome problems in 2007 in the New York Times and Boston Globe at the same time. I believe it was Alan Schwartz's outstanding articles on concussion, more than 50 of them on concussion and concussion-related topics in the New York Times. I believe it was the recognition of chronic traumatic encephalopathy occurring in National Football League players. The first case having been published in 2005, but additional cases coming out in 2007, 8, 9, and 10 that heightened the awareness and caused not only the print media, but obviously the TV media to pick up on this.
And how long have you been concerned about this issue?
Well, I'm a dinosaur. I wrote the first return to play guidelines almost 30 years ago. And so we've been writing and researching about concussion for over 30 years.
So you've known about this for a very long time.
Yes.
Is there any treatment for CTE?
As of you and I talking today, we can treat the symptoms of concussion and we can treat the symptoms of CTE with therapies and, if necessary, medications. But there is no quote-unquote treatment of the underlying disease process itself. Hopefully that will not be much longer, but that is unfortunately the reality today.
And who are some of the well-known players who have been affected?
Well, certainly those that have probably made the most press most recently would be Junior Seau, and before Junior Seau, Dave Duerson, the first NFL player to be diagnosed with CTE was the All-Pro lineman, Hall of Fame player, Mike Webster for the Pittsburgh Steelers.
In Headstrong, ex-football player Duncan Troy says, if you take away hitting in football, you know what you get? Checkers. Do you think football is too violent? And how do you break through the mentality of, quote, playing through pain?
Well, I think football does have to change. I think the head trauma part of it needs to be lessened. And the way to do that, in my mind, is to take intentional hitting of the head out of the sport. I think you can still have a violent, explosive, entertaining game with hitting of all other parts of the body, but not the head, in terms of the intentional site to be targeted.
So what you're saying is that is now an intentional site. It's not illegal to go for the head.
No, great strides have been made by Commissioner Goodell and the National Football League in terms of taking some of the hitting of the most vulnerable people in the head out of the game, meaning their so-called defenseless player you cannot now hit in the head, somebody who can't see the hit coming. But once an individual has, quote-unquote, secured the ball and started to run, you can now intentionally target the head. I think as we go into the future, we need to rethink that, and I would argue we need to take those kinds of hits out of football, that football would still be exciting, entertaining, and our number one TV sport, even without those intentional hits.
What is the outlook for CTE, and how is the science of predicting and treating it advancing?
Well, the science of predicting who's got it is contingent, really, on a good biomarker for this tau protein deposition. And already there are several different companies that are heavily invested with research in this area, and hopefully there will be imaging modalities that will allow us to visualize in real time the accumulation of tau in the brain. And if it can be with a degree of resolution that we can see where the tau is accumulating, then it would be hugely important, because now we would be able to, number one, see people as they're developing CTE in real time and stop people from taking trauma that are showing signs of such accumulation, number one. And number two, have a marker that we could be using to see whether therapies are having a reduction in the progression of CTE or even a regression of the amount of tau protein deposition.
How can we make sports safer in light of all this information, and what safety measures would you like to see implemented in sports?
Well, I think number one, you will reduce significantly the accelerations the brain sees. We can think of that as the violence of the shaking of the brain by having very strong necks, assuming that you saw the hit coming. So number one, anybody playing a contact or collision sport should be working on developing their neck to be every bit as strong as it possibly can be. And by that I mean not just guys playing football, but I mean girls playing soccer, playing ice hockey, and our youth that are playing sports as well. Girls and our youth don't have androgens. They're not going to develop big bulky necks or impressive looking necks like guys can, but they will get stronger necks if they work with a resistive exercise program. And it's the strength that's important. It's not what your neck looks like. Number two, and most importantly, is just understanding that no brain trauma is good brain trauma. You cannot condition the brain to receive blows. You can only injure it. So, whenever possible, minimize the amount of brain trauma that a brain is going to receive. How do you do that? You change the way sports are practiced, and you take the hitting out of practice so that you reduce the brain trauma. The National Football League has already done that. In the new collective bargaining agreement, they can only have full contact practices 14 times in 18 weeks, and they can't have any in the off season. This dramatically reduces the amount of head trauma these athletes are receiving.
Dr. Robert Cantu, thanks for joining us today.
Our pleasure, Susan. Thanks for having me.
I've been speaking with Dr. Robert Cantu, the Director of Sports Medicine at Emerson Hospital in Concord, Massachusetts.